The house, the savings account, the life insurance policy. My daughter-in-law smiled as she slid the single key across the table toward me, the key to my son's old toolbox. That was all I got. My name is Harold, and I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a diesel mechanic in Cookeville, Tennessee, working 6 days a week so my son could go to college, so he could have a life better than the one I'd scraped together with grease-stained hands. I never asked for much. I never expected much. But when my son vanished without a trace on a rainy Tuesday in October, and the people around me started dividing up everything he'd ever owned before his body was even found, I started to understand that the world I thought I knew had been a lie for a very long time. My son, I'll call him by what I always called him, which was Danny, was 38 years old when he disappeared. He was a civil engineer. Smart kid. Always was. He had a house out on Ridgeline Road, a good truck, and a savings account with more money in it than I'd ever seen in my life. He'd worked hard for all of it, the same way I taught him to. He also had a wife he'd married 6 years earlier, a woman I tried to love, for his sake. Even when something in my gut told me she wasn't who she pretended to be. Her name was Melissa. Danny had been acting strange for about 3 months before he disappeared. Quieter than usual. He'd call me sometimes late at night, and I'd hear something in his voice. I couldn't name, not fear exactly. More like the sound a man makes when he's carrying something heavy and trying not to let you see him struggle. I asked him once, point blank, if everything was okay between him and his wife. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Dad, I need you to trust me about something. When the time comes, I need you to trust me." I didn't know what that meant. I told him I always had. He said he knew, and then he changed the subject. 3 weeks later, his truck was found at the bottom of a ravine off Highway 70. Engine still warm. Driver's door hanging open. There were scuff marks on the guardrail. A witness reported seeing a vehicle matching Danny's truck swerve near the edge just before dusk. The sheriff's department launched a search. They pulled the truck out. They searched the ravine, the creek bed below it, the surrounding woods for 2 full days. They found no body. The official determination, after 6 weeks of investigation, was that Danny had gone over the rail in the rain, that the current from the recent flooding had carried him downstream, and that recovery was unlikely. They didn't close the case, but they stopped searching. His death was not legally declared. That takes years in Tennessee, but Melissa didn't wait for the law to catch up. She had a memorial service scheduled within the month. She stood up at the front of that church in a black dress with her brother Craig beside her. And she wept in the way that people weep when they want to be seen weeping. I sat in the 3rd row and held my hat in my hands and tried to breathe. After the service, we went to the house on Ridgeline Road. Melissa's brother Craig had driven down from Nashville for the week, and the two of them moved through Danny's house with a kind of quiet efficiency that turned my stomach. There was a lawyer present, a man I'd never met, who Melissa had apparently retained some weeks prior, and he explained that Danny had updated his will 14 months before his disappearance. Everything went to Melissa. The house, the accounts, the truck they'd already replaced after the accident, the investment portfolio I hadn't even known existed. It was all hers. When the lawyer finished, Melissa looked at me across the dining room table. She didn't look cruel. She looked almost sorry, in the way that someone looks sorry when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. She reached into a cardboard box on the floor beside her chair and set Danny's old toolbox on the table. "Harold," she said. "Danny always said this was yours. He talked about it since the day I met him. Said you taught him how to work with his hands with this box." She slid it toward me. The metal was scratched and dented. The red paint faded to almost pink in places. I'd given it to Danny when he turned 16. I'd had it since I was 22. "I thought you should have it back." Craig smiled from where he stood by the window. It wasn't a warm smile. I took the toolbox home. I set it on the kitchen counter, And then I sat down at my kitchen table and put my face in my hands and stayed there for a long time. I didn't open the toolbox for 11 days. I'm not sure I can explain why. Grief does strange things to a person's logic. That box had my son's fingerprints on it. In some real sense, his memory. His hands. Per the version of him that was 14 years old and learning to change brake pads in my driveway on a Saturday morning. Opening it felt like the last door. Once I opened it, there was nothing left to open. On the 12th day, I got up before sunrise, made coffee, and sat down with the toolbox in front of me. I unlatched the front clasps. The lid creaked the way it always had. Inside, everything was arranged with more care than I would have expected from Danny as a boy. He'd apparently cleaned the tools, oiled them, sorted them by size. There was a handwritten label on one of the inner trays in his handwriting, my son's angular engineer's print that just said Dad's favorites. The socket wrenches I'd used most, the ones he'd watched me use 10,000 times. I was picking up the 3/8 ratchet when my thumb caught on something under the tray. The felt lining along the bottom of the main compartment had been lifted and reglued along one edge, not completely. Just enough to create a small pocket. It was subtle. If you weren't running your hand along every surface the way I was. Out of a bid. Out of old mechanic's instinct. You'd never find it. I worked my thumbnail under the lining. It peeled back softly. Tucked underneath it was a folded square of paper, worn at the crease as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. My hands were shaking when I opened it. It was Danny's handwriting. The note was dated 3 days before his truck went over the ravine. Dad, if you're reading this, then I did what I had to do. And I need you to be calm. I am not dead. I promise you I am not dead. I'm sorry for the pain. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. There's a storage unit on Baxter Road, east of town. Unit 14. The combination is your birthday month. Day. Year. 6 digits. Go alone. Go soon. I love you more than you know. And I will explain everything. Please trust me. You said you always have? I read it 4 times. Then I set it on the table and pressed my hand flat on top of it as if it might disappear. He was alive. My son was alive. The first feeling wasn't relief. I'll be honest about that. The first feeling was something that felt a lot like anger. Because I had spent 6 weeks watching Melissa cry in front of people and shaking hands at a memorial service and sleeping in a house that felt like it had a hole in the floor where my son used to be. But underneath the anger, moving fast, like water under ice, was something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. I waited until after dark to drive to Baxter Road. The self-storage facility was one of those small, no-frills operations on the edge of town, chain-link fencing, fluorescent lights over the keypad entrance, rows of orange roll-up doors. I found Unit 14 at the far end of the second row. Away from the lights, I crouched in front of the padlock and entered my birthday, 0. Is für. On. 2. 5. 7. The lock opened. I lifted the door slowly. Inside, there was a folding chair, a small battery-powered lantern, a sealed plastic bin with "Opened First" written on the lid in marker, and stacked against the back wall boxes. At least 20 of them, labeled in my son's handwriting. Legal documents, financial records, photographs. I sat down in the folding chair, turned on the lantern, and opened the bin. On top was a letter, 12 pages, handwritten on yellow legal pad paper, front and back. I read it without stopping. What Danny had discovered 14 months before his disappearance, around the same time he updated his will, I realized was that Melissa and her brother Craig had been systematically moving money out of his accounts for almost 2 years. Not all at once. Not in ways that triggered alerts. But steadily small transfers to shell accounts. Inflated invoices from a construction company Craig had registered in a name Danny didn't recognize. Forged signatures on a home equity line of credit Danny had never agreed to open. By the time Danny figured out what was happening, they had moved nearly $400,000. When he confronted Melissa, she didn't deny it. She told him that if he went to the police, Craig had enough connections, including a cousin in the district attorney's office, to make sure Danny was the one who ended up facing fraud charges. She had documents. She said, forged ones. That would make Danny look like the architect of the whole scheme. She had been careful. She had been patient. She had married him for this. Danny went to a private attorney he'd found in Nashville. Someone with no connection to anyone in their county. He spent weeks quietly gathering what he could, but the deeper he dug, the more he understood that they'd planned for him. Every exit he could see was blocked. If he filed charges, the forged documents went public. If he disappeared with the evidence, they'd find him. They had access to his email, his phone, his location through their shared accounts. So he planned his own disappearance. He'd been funneling small amounts of money for months into an account Melissa knew nothing about enough to live on. He had a contact, a college friend who owed him a favor, who had a cabin in eastern Kentucky. Off-grid. No lease in Danny's name. He staged the accident on a night with heavy rain and flooding, knowing that the current would make recovery unlikely. He left no body because there was no body. The guardrail damage was real. He'd nudged the truck hard enough at low speed to leave marks, but he'd stepped out of the vehicle in the dark, walked a quarter-mile through the woods to a waiting car, and been in Kentucky by midnight. But before he left, he made sure the truth was preserved. Everything was in those boxes. Bank records, screenshots, emails, the forged documents alongside the originals that proved they were forgeries, the registration papers for Craig's shell company, a notarized statement from the Nashville attorney. At the bottom of the letter, Danny had written the name and phone number of a federal financial crimes investigator in Knoxville, a woman he'd already been in contact with before he disappeared. He'd sent her a copy of the letter and a digital version of the documents through the Nashville attorney. She was expecting my call. He ended the letter the way he used to end voicemails when he was in college. I know this is a lot. I know I put you through something no father should go through, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. But I needed them to believe it. I needed her to feel safe long enough for the case to be built. The investigator needs someone they trust to hand over the physical documents. That's you. Dad. It was always going to be you. You're the only person in my life I was completely sure of. Take care of yourself. I'll be in touch soon. D. I sat in that storage unit for a long time after I finished reading. There's a particular quality to silence when you're 67 years old and you've just found out your son is alive. It's not quiet. Exactly. It's more like the world suddenly has more room in it than it did an hour ago. Like someone opened a window you'd forgotten existed. I called the investigator the next morning. Her name was Agent Whitfield, and she was already familiar with my son's name and the outline of the case. She had been waiting. She asked me to meet her in Knoxville the following day and to bring the documents. She told me not to discuss the situation with anyone, particularly anyone connected to Melissa or Craig. I drove to Knoxville alone. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Agent Whitfield and 2 colleagues went through the boxes with me. Item be item. Asking questions. I did my best to answer. At the end of the meeting, she told me that the digital evidence Danny had already provided, combined with the physical documents I just handed over, constituted a strong federal case for wire fraud, bunkfraud, and conspiracy. She said the forged documents Melissa had threatened Danny with were, in her words, amateur work that wouldn't have held up under any serious forensic examination. The threat had been largely a bluff, but Danny hadn't known that when he made his decision. She also told me something that took me a moment to process. Danny had been in contact with her office twice in the past week. He knew I'd found the note. The toolbox had a small magnetic sensor on the inside of the lid. something Danny had rigged himself that sent a signal to a prepaid device he was monitoring. When the lid opened, he knew. He'd been waiting for me to go to Knoxville before he came home. I drove back to Cookeville that evening and pulled into my driveway just after 9. There was a light on in my kitchen that I hadn't left. There was a truck I didn't recognize parked at the end of the block. I sat in my car for a moment, and then I got out. My son was sitting at my kitchen table. He was thinner than I remembered. He'd grown a beard. He was wearing a flannel shirt I didn't recognize, and he had a cup of coffee in his hands that he'd made in my kitchen, in my coffee pot, the way he'd been doing since he was a teenager. He looked up when I came through the door, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then I crossed the kitchen and put my arms around him, and my son held on to me the way he hadn't since he was a small boy. And we stood there in my kitchen for a long time. We talked until 2 in the morning. He told me things that filled in the gaps in the letter. He told me about the night he staged the accident, how he'd stood in the dark at the edge of those woods, listening to his truck hit the guardrail and the sound of the metal giving way, and how he'd had to force himself not to think about what I would feel when I heard. He'd told himself it was temporary. He'd told himself it was the only way. He told himself that I would understand when the time came. And then he'd walked through the rain to the car and driven north, and tried to believe the things he was telling himself. He'd watched the memorial service through a live stream a neighbor had posted online. He'd watched me sit in the 3rd row with my hat in my hands. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. It was the 4th or 5th time he'd said it that night, and each time he said it, it was quieter than the time before. "You did what you had to do." I said, "I should have found another way. Maybe. But you're here now." He nodded. He looked like he hadn't slept well in a long time. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning. About 3 weeks later, I wasn't there. But Agent Whitfield called me afterward. Melissa was taken into custody at the house on Ridgeline Road. Craig was arrested at his office in Nashville. The DA's cousin, it turned out, had known nothing about the scheme and had never been approached that had been a bluff too. Another layer of a story designed to make Danny feel cornered. The charges were serious. Federal wire fraud alone carries decades. With the conspiracy charge and the additional bank fraud counts, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Knoxville was talking about a case they were confident going to trial with. My son began the legal process of establishing that he was, in fact, alive. It was more complicated than it sounds. And it took months. And there were lawyers involved who charged rates that made my mechanic's sensibility physically uncomfortable. But by the spring, Danny was legally Danny again. His accounts were flagged as part of the federal case, and the recovery process for the moved money was slow. But it had begun. He stayed with me for most of those months, sleeping in his old room with the pennant from his college on the wall and the same twin bed he'd had since he was 12. Some mornings I'd come downstairs early and find him already up, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, the way I'd found him that first night. He was seeing a counselor in Cookeville twice a week. He wasn't sleeping well, and then gradually he was quiet for a while, and then gradually he wasn't. In March, he drove me out to Ridgeline Road. The house was in legal limbo as part of the case couldn't be sold. Couldn't be transferred, but it was still there. Empty now. The windows dark. He didn't want to go inside. We just sat in the truck in the driveway for a minute. "I'm going to sell it," he said. "When I can. I don't want to live there. You don't have to. I'm thinking about buying something smaller, maybe closer to you." I didn't say anything to that. I just nodded. He looked over at me. "I put you through something nobody should go through. I know that. You did. I keep waiting for you to be angrier about it." I thought about that for a moment, really thought about it. The way you have to when someone asks you something real. I had been angry. At the beginning, not at Danny, but at the situation, at Melissa. At the version of my life where my son was gone and there was a woman smiling at me across a table and sliding a toolbox toward me like it was a consolation prize. That anger had burned for a while. But it's hard to stay angry at someone who hid a note in the one thing in the world he knew I'd eventually open, because he knew me that well. It's hard to stay angry at a man who engineered his own disappearance with precision and care and left a 12-page handwritten letter in a storage unit so his father would understand. I think, I said slowly, that you knew I'd find the note. You knew I wouldn't just leave that box on the counter forever. I knew you'd find it within a month. He said, I gave it 3 weeks max. It took me 11 days. He smiled for the first time in a while. That's actually longer than I expected. We drove home in the early afternoon light. Through the hills and the pine trees and the pale spring sky over Cookville, and I thought about what my father used to say when I was a boy, that a man doesn't always know what he has until it's nearly gone. My father was a simple man, a farmer, not given to much philosophy. But he'd been right about that one. I still have the toolbox on my kitchen counter. Danny offered to take it back, said it was mine to begin with. I told him to let me keep it a while longer. Some evenings I sit at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I rest my hand on the lid of that battered red metal box. And I think about the fact that my son knew me well enough to know I would feel every scratch and every dent, would run my thumb along every surface the way I always have. The way a man does with tools he has loved for a long time. He hid the truth in the place he knew I'd find it. That's the kind of man I raised. And I am grateful for every single day. If you've ever had someone leave something behind for you, a note, an object, a message you didn't understand until much later, I'd like to hear about it. Drop it in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.